Hello and welcome to part 3 of 5 of an introduction to the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Now, as you might have noticed from the other two parts, I am joined by the excellent Dan Freeman to discuss these, and this part will continue on with some more articles. It's a long treaty, but we're going through it bit by bit because frankly, that's the best way to look at it. Talking about a treaty as a whole and not going through its components means you miss quite a lot of the subtext and quite a lot of the content in it, which is why we're doing it this way. Anyway, hope you enjoy. As always, there's a link to Dan's channel down below in the description. And if you're interested in more videos like this, please do subscribe and tick the little bell next to the subscribe button. That always gives you an update.
I'm thinking I'm going to skip, Article 11, I will read it out, but I'll go straight into Article 12, because Article 11 really doesn't include anything which is that revolutionary or interesting. It's just Article 11, subject provisions of Article 2 of the present treaty. The rules for disposal contained in Annex 2 to this Part 2 shall be applied to all vessels of war to dispose of under said treaty and to aircraft carriers as defined in Article 3. So Article 12 is where it gets interesting.
Shall I read out Article 12?
Oh, you can if you want to. Yeah?
Give your voice a rest. So, Article 12, Part 1, subject to any supplementary agreements which may modify, as between the high contracting parties concerned, the list in Annex 3 to this Part 2, the special vessels shown therein may be retained and their tonnage shall not be included in the tonnage subject to limitation. So this is monitors and things like that being exempt. Yep. 2. Any other vessel constructed, adapted, or acquired to serve the purposes for which these special vessels are retained shall be charged against the tonnage of the appropriate combatant category according to the characteristics of the vessel, unless such vessels conform to the characteristics of vessels exempt from limitations under Article 8. 3. Japan may, however, replace the mine layers Aso and Tokiwa by 2 new mine layers before the 31st of December 1936. The standard displacements of each of the new vessels shall not exceed 5,000 tons, 5,080 metric tons. Their speed shall not exceed 20 knots, and their characteristics shall conform to the provisions of paragraph B of Article 8. The new vessels shall be regarded as special vessels, and their tonnage shall not be chargeable to the tonnage of any combatant category. The Aso and Tokiwa shall be disposed of in accordance with Section 1 or 2 of Annex 2 to this Part 2 on completion of the replacement vessels. You can tell that there have been more politicians involved. It's really more and more like lawyers have had their hands on this, haven't they?
Yes.
Part 5. The Asana, Yakumo, Izumo, Iwate, and Kasuga shall be disposed of in accordance with Section 1 or 2 of Annex 2 to this Part 2 when the first 3 vessels of the Kuma class have been replaced by new vessels. These 3 vessels of the Kuma class shall be reduced to the condition as prescribed in Section 5, subparagraph B2 of Annex 2 of this Part 2 and are to be used for training ships, and their tonnage shall not thereafter be included in the tonnage subject to limitation.
And I'm going to let you do Article 13 as well, but then I will do Annex 1 because the rules for replacement, because that's just a whole load of mathematical stuff.
Yeah. So, Article 13, existing ships of various types which, prior to the 1st of April 1930, have been used as stationary training establishments or hulks, may be retained in a non-seagoing condition.
So basically all of this is governing what you can and can't build, and Japan was causing such an interesting commotion that they had to do it by special fiat and special dispensation.
Yeah. And it's worth saying that the Japanese, I don't know if it was in their mind to do this at this stage, they would exploit this, and the Hiei, which, going back a couple of pages, they retained from the scrapping and turned into a training ship, they did actually remilitarize between, I think, 36 and 40.
Yep.
So I don't know if this was going through their minds at this stage that they would potentially do that, or at least use them as potentially military auxiliaries. But it's definitely.
It was certainly going through someone's mind as a possibility, and they were trying to get rid of them by legislation. But this is one of the trouble when you're trying to legislate against countries doing something. Countries have an awful lot of space and an awful lot of reasons for something not to have got done. And sometimes those are the legitimate reasons, and sometimes they are not. Hence why Annex 1 rules for a replacement is where we'll stop looking at the treaty, but it's where we sort of really should start looking at the treaty in many respects. Section 1. Except as provided in Section 3 of this Annex and 3 of the present treaty, a vessel shall not be replaced before it becomes over age. A vessel shall be deemed to be over age when the following number of years have elapsed since the date of its completion. A. For a first surface vessel exceeding 3,000 tons, 3,048 metric tons, but not exceeding 10,000 tons, 10,160 metric tons standard. I, if laid down before the 1st of January 1920, 16 years. II, if laid down after the 31st of January 1919, 20 years. B. For a surface vessel not exceeding 3,000 tons, 3,048 metric tons standard displacement, I, if laid down before the 1st of January 1921, 12 years. II, if laid down after the 31st of December 1920, 16 years. For a submarine, C, 13 years. The keels of replacement tonnage shall not be laid down more than 3 years before the year in which the vessel to be replaced becomes over age. But this period is reduced to 2 years in the case of any replacement vessel not exceeding 3,000 tons, 3,048 metric tons and displacement. The right of replacement is not lost by delay in laying down replacement tonnage. Section 2, except as otherwise provided in present treaty to vessels or vessels whose retention would cause the maximum tonnage permitted in the category to be exceeded, shall on the completion or acquisition of replacement tonnage be disposed of in accordance with Annex 2 to this Part 2. Section 3, in the event of loss or accident or destruction, a vessel may be immediately replaced. And that's quite important. That that is the criteria which is governing the rule, what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, and how you are going to be replacing getting your ships. And that suddenly starts to make sense of why certain vessels are still hanging around in 1939. And you're looking and going, you look so old-fashioned, out of place. Well, you can't replace them. It's not like the 1900s and the 1910 and even the 1910s. The prior to World War I, where they were literally going, that ship looks ancient, get rid of it, build a new one. They can't do that. They have to. They have to build.
The little thing, crystals in their palms are starting to flash red.
Yeah. You can only do what you are required to do. You can only build what you're allowed to do. And it's a very strict... It's important, though, these treaties. This treaty does sort of make a big thing about the limitations.
Yeah. I mean, and it's also, they have been written by people who understand the different wiggles you would... admittedly, I think most of the wiggles that are being blocked off are the ones that Britain would have been considered guilty of. In that,
I would say it opens up whole wiggle rooms for Britain. I would say this treaty does open up a whole new wiggle room. I'd say prior to this treaty, it gives wiggle room. I would say actually this treaty really it takes the wiggle room away from the two Pacific powers more than it does Britain.
Yeah, I think that the Pacific powers might well not realise that, though.
Yeah.
Because what's happening with all of this is, Britain is saying, we will stop building lots of ships for other countries, that if you go to war with us, or look like you're going to go to war with us, we're going to nab and not actually hand over
But they actually do that anyway because they break the treaty immediately World War II begins. But what's interesting is we go through exactly who was there at this treaty. And I would like to point out, you have the President of the United States of America sends Henry L. Stinson, Secretary of State. Charles G. Dawes, Ambassador to the Court of St. James. Charles Francis Adams, Secretary of the Navy. Joseph T. Robinson, Senator from the state of Arkansas. David A. Reed, Senator from the state of Pennsylvania. Gibson, Ambassador to Belgium. And Dwight M. W. Morrow, Ambassador to Mexico, are sent as his representatives. From the France, there's Mr. André Tanu, Deputy President of the Council of Ministers, Minister of the Interior. Mr. Astinan Briand, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Jacques-Louis Donicel, Deputy Minister of the Marine. Mr. Francois Petry, Deputy Minister of the Colonies. Mr. Aimé Joseph de Ferrou, Ambassador of the French Republic at the Court of St. James.
It's worth saying that the French Prime Minister, in a wonderful display of the politics of France at the time, does get ousted for a week.
Yes.
Which I just find absolutely hilarious because that is so interwar France.
Yeah.
And the unstable politics. Sorry.
And then we have the British ones. So let's see if there are names you can remember. For Great Britain and Her Majesty the Great King of Great Britain, Ireland and British Dominions, beyond the seas, Emperor of India, send for Great Britain and Northern Ireland and all parts of the British Empire, which are not separate members of the League of Nations, the Right Honourable James Ramsay MacDonald, MP, Lord of the Treasury and Prime Minister. The Right Honourable Arthur Henderson, MP, his Principal Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. The Right Honourable Albert Victor Alexander, MP, the First Lord of the Admiralty. The Right Honourable William Wedgwood Benn, his Principal Secretary of State for India. For the Dominion of Canada, Colonel the Honourable James Leighton Ralston, a member of his Privy Council for Canada, his Minister for National Defence. The Honourable Philip Roy, a member of his Privy Council for Canada, his Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary in France for the Dominion of Canada. For the Commonwealth of Australia, the Honourable James Edward Frenton, his Minister for Trade and Customs. For the Dominion of New Zealand, Thomas Mason Wilford, Esquire, KC High Commissioner of the Dominion of New Zealand in London. For the Union of South Africa, Charles Theodore Tearwater, Esquire, High Commissioner for the Union of South Africa in London. For the Irish Free State, Timothy Aloysius Smithy, Esquire, High Commissioner for the Irish Free State in London. For India, Sir Atul Chandra Chatterjee, KCIE, High Commissioner for India in London. His Majesty the King of Italy sent the Honourable Dino Grande, his Minister of Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Admiral of Division, the Honourable Giuseppe Sirani, Senator of the Kingdom, his Minister Secretary of State for Marine. Mr. Antonio Chimato Borondo, his Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the Court of St. James. And Admiral the Honourable Baron Alfredo Acton, Senator of the Kingdom. And His Majesty the Emperor of Japan sent Mr. Reiji Watsuki, member of the House of Peers. Admiral Takeshi Takarabe, Minister for the Navy. Mr. Suno Matsusarere, his Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary at the Court of St. James. And Mr. Matsuso Nagai, his Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to His Majesty the King of Belgium. Now, let's look at this, but honestly, the British, yeah, everyone's sending some quite high-profile peoples, but let's be honest, the British have sent the first team. Admittedly, they have the advantage, they're hosting it, but they have sent the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Admiralty, First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Secretary of State for India. These are the big people in the British government at the time. And also, these people will all be supported by people. Yes, there aren't a large number of... there are lots of admirals of the Royal Navy wandering around at this point.
So the other
getting involved.
I think's an interesting bit to know is the transition from what you might have expected at, say, 1922, certainly pre-World War I, which is that quite a lot of the bits of the British Empire, in inverted commas, are now dominions, which means that they are of equal standing with Britain, and they are represented by themselves. Now,
Yeah.
South Africa and Ireland don't really have navies. New Zealand has the New Zealand division, but Australia and Canada have navies. India certainly ends up with a navy, and in 1932 they get the Indian Air Force. And by Indian Air Force, the Indian Air Force, I was looking at this, on its establishment had somebody who sounds as the kind of first commander, because it was all of a flight of aircraft, but then 6 men whose names certainly sound Indian to me as the pilots. So what's going on in India? It's not fast enough. It's far too late. I'm not trying to pretend that colonialism didn't happen and that things were wonderful, but things were in India. There was a recognition that India should actually be run by Indians in the same way that Canada was being run by Canadians, Australia by Australians, etc. And that's really quite a big shift.
Again, the point I'd also like to make about the British one of this, all these British people there, they're the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
It's MacDonald, it's Henderson, it's Victor Alexander, it's Wedgwood Ben. These are the Labour Party. And
Ramsay MacDonald is a very interesting figure.
Yes, it's a case of, because, they are, statedly publicly, they are very keen on peace, they're very keen on disarmament treaties and all these things. And yet the treaty they are putting through, whilst it is, yes, disarmament in many respects, is also very, very strong for Britain. It's a very strong foreign policy treaty for Britain in terms of allowing it to do the stuff it needs to do with its navy. Yes, maybe not at the pace we'd have loved to it. We'd love those to 16 and 20 years to being 12 and 16 years, and the other one to have been even less to, boost things. And there is the fact that actually Henderson was very keen on peace, but was very much pushing for it. This is Arthur Henderson, the Foreign Secretary, not the Admiral. But it's still there. This treaty is still being done, and it's being put through by these people. It's a very big, very high-profile group being sent for it.
And Ramsay MacDonald, I think I would probably put myself, this is the problem, that the politics of, there is a link of the politics in Britain of 1932, 2020 to a vague extent, but I would put myself probably to the left of you, but not necessarily going to say I'm a fan of Ramsay MacDonald, and I certainly think that they were operating in a very different environment, so I don't know where I'd sit if it was 1930, but Ramsay MacDonald, he was a man of principle. He and he also wasn't loony left. So I was looking at his kind of biog, and what I found interesting was he pretty much helped set up the Labour Party when it first started. And then in 1914, he resigned as leader because he personally didn't feel he could support the government, whereas the Labour Party wanted to support the government when World War I started. And his son was a conscientious objector, and apparently he went out at some point during the war to the trenches and was personally, he and whoever it was he was with, they went right into the trenches, properly to the front, and didn't make a big thing of it, but actually were in the bits which were getting shelled and everything. Didn't make a thing of it ever. So he does seem to have been a man of principle in all those things. His son was a conscientious objector and was part of one of the ambulances. So he'd sort of, but then at the same time, he was one of the key reasons why the Labour Party didn't go communist in the 20s when the Russian Communist Party post-revolution were going round and trying to, from the point of view of the West, stir up trouble everywhere, which is what you get in lots of other places like France and
I'll
Germany.
just say quickly, I am listening, but something weird is happening out the front door, so I'm not being rude to you. I am listening, and if our viewers see this bit, I apologise. Me quickly checking what's going on at the front door.
So I think Ramsay MacDonald was sensible enough to realise that the idea that if you want peace, prepare for war was probably the most sensible way forward for Britain that wanted peace, and he did. Similarly, Henry Stimson was another one I had to look at, and he's another somewhat interesting person.
Yep.
So he was Herbert Hoover's Secretary of State from March 29, when Hoover, I think through the entirety of Hoover, but he Secretary of State for War under Taft in 1911 to 1913. During the First World War, he had, when Teddy Roosevelt tried to raise a kind of volunteer army to go and fight, he joined that and been quite prominent in that. He then, when that was quashed by Wilson, who I really don't like, and the more I read about him I dislike, he then joined the regular US Army, rose to the rank colonel by August 1918, saw action, and he seems to be somebody who kind of didn't want war, but reckoned it has to happen. You go in and you go in hard. Largely a man of principle. He shut down the Cipher Bureau of the State Department when he kind of came to run it because he saw it as ungentlemanly, which is probably stupid, but is at least...
It's a man of principles, but it's the sort of principles you shouldn't let anywhere near running your comms.
No.
No.
And he was also FDR's Secretary of State for War for, I think, the 1940 to 45.
Yeah.
So he was one of these people who, and I mean, reading some of the stuff he said about Nicaragua and some of the other places, it's something along the lines of, they're not civilized enough to rule themselves. Because he also was governor of the Philippines for a while, and you just sit there and go, oh my god, people actually said that. About
yes, some people did.
Beings.
Yes, they did. Because they treated civilization as something which was, a fixed sort of goal in many respects, but also a movable feast. They always compared them to yourselves and found people wanting. It's not nice. But, I've...
and it's required from both parties in a sexual encounter.
Yes, or possibly it was the fellow who didn't consent. We're not quite sure, but in that case, I really do not know. I love the Royal Navy and some of its naming, its ship's naming. It's just, it's like when it says bring back Leander class, and I go, yes, I'd like to bring back Leander class, but then I look at the names and think, can I have veto? There are some names I'd really not like brought back.
But it's just all over the classics. I mean, I was looking at in the last week or so, went to the National Gallery, went to the Titian exhibition. Amazing stuff, but you look at the stories behind those paintings, and it's Zeus or Jupiter turned himself into this and went off to shag somebody. It's like, you're having to turn yourself into a golden shower, which is a thing in itself, especially given currently. to seduce somebody, is that really fair? If you're,
Don't get me started.
It annoys me. And this isn't the forum for talking about it, but it's something that should be discussed generally, not suppressed, not ignored, but discussed to point out why it shouldn't happen and what's unacceptable about it.
But I do think, and we might well do another video as well, but I think definitely for a video on, well, the first collection of recording, I think we've done a jolly good job of going through the entire treaty. Shall we do another recording at some point on the context of the treaty?
I'm just trying to think if there's anything else.
When I did?
Mainly the part 3. I do not understand why the Japanese agreed to it. I just don't. It just screws them over. And France and Italy didn't sign, so it clearly wasn't de rigueur. And from what I can tell, it was one of the things that turned Japan of roughly 1900 to 1930-ish, which was a democracy, which was really quite Western, where actually you look at the prime ministers and almost none of them have a military background, into this, insane, extremist, nationalistic, army-run thing less than a decade later. And part of me wonders if it's because these politicians agreed to these sorts of constraints that, okay, the Japanese economy and shipbuilding capacity probably couldn't have done what they wanted, but by blocking them, you create something for those pressures to press against, and you create a lot of unhappiness that people can unify behind. Although it does lead to these, again, almost laughable that people lost their lives, overweight, overgunned Japanese designs where they go, oh, we're now limited, so we can't put... So the destroyer, which we were making at 2,000 tons, the Fubuki class, we now are limited to 1,500 tons. Take everything you put in a 2,000 ton, 1,850 ton destroyer and put in a 1,500 ton hull. We can do it, but... Oh, and it must go faster.
Yeah.
Hello. Hope you enjoyed that. I know I did. I'd say I love these videos with Dan. They are a lot of fun. They're a lot of fun to make, and they were a lot of fun to research. So I hope you've enjoyed part 3 of 5, and I'll be recording next part after Brew Ships. So thank you, everyone. Take care, and see you in part 4.